Greetings, everyone. My name is Peter Young, and I'm one of the 4 volunteers for the Yale Career Panels, of which this is one. I'd like to just take a minute or two to just remind people about the history and the purpose of these programs, but also how we're going to handle this 1-hour webcast on what I think is going to be very, very exciting. I think the whole fintech area is an exciting area for people in terms of careers. And this whole series started over 10 years ago, April of 2012, I believe it is. And it was started by a group of volunteers because I think there was a recognition that Yale students and alumni, they're very smart, well-educated, but did not have really a good place to get accurate information about different careers. And so there were a lot of stories of people who went to law school because they watched all these TV shows about law. And a great example now is an unbelievable number of people are going to forensic science schools because they watch NCIS or Bones. And then they learn rudely that, the New York forensic department is not nearly as sexy as it's what's on TV. So the goal here is really try to give those of you who are in the audience a really balanced, candid view about fintech, so that you can make a career decision based on kind of a candid, balanced set of information. I am very, very pleased to have our panelists who are with us today. Unfortunately, Janine Yorio, who is the CEO and co-founder of Every Realm, she emailed me this afternoon that her daughter is ill, so she had to bow out. But we have 2 really terrific panelists. I'm going to briefly just introduce them. Doug Atkin, who I've known for, I guess, 25, 30 years.
Too many years.
Yeah, he has had an extraordinary background in the whole financial technology industry. When I first met him, he was the CEO of Instinet, that was the world's first electronic stock exchange. He was the CEO. He took it public in 2001. Subsequently, he was a co-founder of Efficient Frontiers, a consulting and research firm specializing in trading technology, regulation, and market structure. And then he was the CEO of Majestic Research, a data-driven research firm that provided data to global fund managers. And then most recently, he ran Guggenheim Partners venture business. He is now also part of a partnership called Communitas, and they're investors in fintech companies as well as others. So, Doug is very qualified to be on this panel by virtue of his work experience and his knowledge and his investment experience over a number of years. Bryce Nyberg, who's a director of Berkadia Digital, he is also head of Be Engaged, which is Berkadia's startup accelerator. Those of you who don't know Berkadia, it's a leader in commercial real estate industry. And the question is, well, why is he here for fintech? Well, the reality is they are very, very heavily invested in innovation in fintech, mortgage tech, prop tech, through partnerships, investments, and acquisitions. In fact, they actively invest and acquire, fintech companies. And Bryce has the role of overseeing these companies. And as we all know, the real estate business is a heavy innovator in the area of fintech. So we have 2 people who are very knowledgeable about fintech, very involved. They're more investors and partners. Janet was more of an operator, but we really have plenty of talent and knowledge on this panel. Last thing is the way we're going to do this. We have an hour in total. I have about 6 questions that I'm going to ask our 2 panelists. They know what the questions are, so if they look shocked, it won't be because they didn't know the questions. But also, we want to make sure that we have time at the end for questions from you in the audience. And due to the limitations of Zoom, the best we can do is you can type your questions in to either the chat box or the Q&A chat box. And if you have questions that come to you, go ahead and type them in, even while the panel is still going, because we'll be able to see them on the screen, and then we'll leave at least 10 minutes at the end to really try to answer your questions. So with that, let me first start out with actually a very important question, which is, what the hell is fintech? And I say that, and we don't have to say that for all these career panels, because usually, for example, most people know what architecture is, for example, or law. But fintech is particularly tricky because there's so many different aspects of fintech. And I tried to Google definitions of fintech, and when I got to 35 definitions, I decided that I would punt, and I would just start first by asking my panelists, put them on the spot, and just say, how would you define fintech? And in particular, I know there are lots of different segments, right, of fintech. So let me ask our panelists if they can help the audience sort of understand what is fintech and what are the different segments relevant in terms of career decisions, right? So Doug, you're alphabetically first in your last name.
Oh, gosh. Well, first of all, Peter, thanks so much for including me on this panel. It's and what you're doing just in general with helping Yale students is very admirable. I wish you would do the same with Tufts students, but anyway, my alma mater. So yeah, what is fintech? I think a way we look at it is maybe the evolution of the industry. So the first, if you will, the first phase of fintech, which is, you said, I was fortunate enough to be involved with, this was way back in the 80s, was the pure digitization of markets. So you had technology change the way equities were traded, fixed income was traded, FX, and so on and so forth, and research being produced. Sort of what we've been going through over the last, 7 to 10 years, I would call it fintech companies and products being embedded in other industries. So things like buy now, pay later, embedded in, let's say, retailers, online retailers, and things, and all kinds of fintech lenders. And then, of course, the next phase where there's a lot of noise, huge amount of noise, but there are core value props is in Web3 and decentralized finance.
Mm-hmm. Bryce, any comments?
Yeah, I mean, good answer by Doug. So I won't take anything away from it, but maybe say that to your earlier point about segments in fintech, it is broad and growing, continually growing, frankly. And a lot of things that I see, and I should caveat that my lens is through this commercial real estate, mortgage, tech side of things. It's certainly fintech, given I work out of a financial services business. We see a ton. We see a ton that's moving into real estate. Real estate saw just a massive amount of influx of venture capital in the space, and a lot of that was due to venture tech moving in, or fintech, I should say, moving into commercial real estate technology and playing in different segments in commercial real estate. So we saw something like 5 or 6 million back in 2016 being invested in commercial real estate tech. Now that's up to 32 million as of last year. So a huge amount, and that meant with it a number of kind of variations of fintech entering the space, and those kind of permutations are happening not just in real estate tech, but across the board. So tons of things. It is a little bit hard to put a firm definition around fintech because there's so many expanses of it. But things that are touching financial services, the innovation around financial services, that might be some core piece of fintech that we can speak to.
You know, I might as well raise the question about the 800-pound, you know, elephant in the room, and that is all the publicity around FTX, right? So, you know, and I'm raising it mainly because I think it's very important for you to help the audience understand how to think about that, and whether that, you know, what it really means in terms of, you know, from a career point of view. Does that mean, you know, everything's tainted and messed up or whatever? So, you know, it's been in the headlines every day now for quite a while. So if you put yourselves in the shoes of the attendees, but with your knowledge of what FTX is all about and some other bankruptcies, how should they think about it? Should they just ignore it unless they're interested in a very specific segment, or what should they think?
Yeah, great question. I don't know that I would ignore it, right? It's certainly a valid data point to look at, something interesting, something big in the news. But it is centered around crypto exchanges in particular. And so if that's a segment that you've been really interested in, then it's a bigger data point for you to be concerned with. And if crypto hasn't been at the center of what you're thinking about related to fintech, then maybe not as much of a concern for you. But certainly it's going to change how investors look at anything related to crypto and Web3, frankly. This is going to have a ripple effect through the industry. Investors are going to be much more concerned about what's happening behind the scenes at these companies and be more careful about what they're investing in, and traction is going to be a little bit slower for those companies that are trying to be in adjacent spaces to that company.
Doug, any comments on FTX?
Yeah, I could spend probably 3 hours on FTX, but it's pure fraud, obviously. Peter, where we focus out of the fund, and given Tom, Duncan, and I come out of, the market structure, core market structure, businesses, I would just say what's sorely needed, and where we've been spending our time investing in, crypto, so to speak, is this industry needs industrial strength infrastructure. So it needs custody, it needs regulation, it needs, clean data, it needs all the stuff that other asset classes have. So I think when you all are looking at companies in the space, I guess my suggestion would be to stay away from the bright, shiny objects and, really go towards things that have to do with providing much needed infrastructure.
Yeah. Well, I'm not an expert in fintech and so forth, but since I run an investment bank, there's one thing I do know, which is being regulated. And it is unfortunate that a lot of new areas, regulation has to catch up. And in this case, clearly the regulators weren't fast enough, right, to try to nail down regulations that would have at least made this not as big a problem, right?
Yeah, and we turned down many business investment opportunities, so to speak, because we felt people, in essence, were offering securities, but not claiming they were securities. Our view is people should be not begging for regulation, but regulation will bring back. It's the only way to really turn this into an asset class.
Yeah, no, because by very nature, big chunks of fintech have to be regulated in order for them to succeed, basically, right?
Yeah.
So my first broad question is, I think you answered the first part, which is where is the profession heading? And I think, Bryce, you made some comments, and Doug, you made some comments saying it's exciting, but not all parts of fintech are as exciting as each other. Where do you see the areas that you think are most exciting for people in terms of sort of, long-term growth and career prospects?
Yeah, I think there's a number of opportunities in fintech. So when you say fintech, it doesn't have to be narrow to AI, code and write code. So I'm trying to reference one of the earlier questions in the Q&A that I saw pop up as well. Being a software developer is not the prerequisite for being in fintech, but being strategic, being thoughtful, being able to multitask certainly matters in this industry. And so you have a good opportunity to enter fintech regardless of your past skill set. If you can position yourself as a thought leader in the space, someone that's taken the opportunity and the time to dig in on an area of expertise that matters to fintech. So I think there's plenty of room for growth. If you want to be a marketer, there's space for marketers in fintech. If you want to be in sales, there's space for sales in fintech. Now, if you want to be an entrepreneur in the space, hopefully you bring with you either a great network of software developers and folks that are expert in that space, or you have your own expertise in the space. So I think there's a wide variety of positions and opportunities in fintech, and room for growth, right? I wouldn't take FTX as some sort of new cap on fintech or something that should scare you away, but there's plenty of opportunity, and there's going to be a lot more growth, and a lot of more segments are going to be touched by fintech. Commercial real estate is just one example that I'm close to of where it's growing, and we anticipate it to grow quite a bit more.
Yeah, but you have to do your homework, right? Because I mean, first of all things equal, if it's always better to be in a growth industry than it's just not growth industry, right? Not to say that you couldn't have fun being an executive in the steel industry, but the growth by itself creates a lot of opportunities, and I think fintech does. But not all areas of growth are necessarily good opportunities, right? Doug, are there any particular, because the nice thing, Doug, is that you look across all these different segments, right? I mean, because as an investor, that's what you're supposed to do. Can you think of a couple that you think in particular you think you would, you suggest that people look at as a long-term career opportunity?
I mean, yes, I would just say, first figure out, what you'd want to be a part of. Like, do you like being involved in something that touches retail investors, which is a lot different than, let's say, a company we're an investor in that builds, in essence, the iOS for all blockchain developers. Two very, very different companies with two missions. I think there's opportunities across the board. I do think the area that's been hit particularly hard are companies that do touch retail and lend money, and really, we're losing money on every trade and trying to make it up on volume. So you need to really be careful. Lastly, the way I look at it is we're all venture capitalists. If you're looking for a job, actually you have a very concentrated portfolio, right? Which is one, right? Something, a company you're working for or at. And I think you need to choose wisely and only do it if you're really passionate about it. Yeah. Because that comes through.
By the way, usually at the beginning of each one of these, when I'm the moderator, I'm not always the moderator, I take 1 minute and make the following comment, which is all the information in the world that Bryce or Doug could provide you about fintech won't do you any good if you don't know yourself. So, and essentially Doug is sort of saying that, right? Which is, it's very important for you to know yourself. What do you love? What do you not love? What are you good at? What you're not good at? And obviously this panel won't answer that question, but I strongly urge all of you who are listening to do a pretty good and kind of brutally honest self-assessment to make sure you understand yourself. And my father put it, he was a professor, and he said, if you're the kind of person who needs closure on projects in 4 weeks, don't become a professor because you're lucky if you can finish a book in 5 years. He said it's an obvious mismatch, right? So that's what you really want to be able to do. Now, the next question, Bryce, you actually started to answer. So I know you were looking ahead. You're probably one of those guys in tests always look at the next question, right? But
That must have been it.
question
Yeah.
how do you get into the profession, which is you were sort of talking about, and what's
Sure.
a typical career path? This is a little bit hard because it's a relatively new area. So it's not like you can say, well, gee, investment banking, here's a typical career path of the last 100 years, right? But, how do you get in the profession? And what do you think is either the typical career path or will be the typical career path? Bryce, you want to start? Because you started sort of talking about that.
Sure.
You don't have to be
Yeah.
a coder, you could be a variety of things, right?
You can be a variety of things, and certainly the path to entering fintech is probably unique for each person. I'd say to Doug's earlier comment about figuring out where you want to play, you're going to get a flavor today, right, of fintech, but you can certainly go out and find some individuals that are closer to where you want to start in your career and do some interviews with them. I think that's absolutely worth doing. I think product and being a head of product is a good opportunity for folks that have a diverse skill set, and finding the perfect education for product is not out there right now, I don't think. You can get some exposure. I know a number of business majors that became heads of product and have moved up within organizations in fintech and outside of fintech, but in software companies, that they started with a business background and maybe even an accounting background and pivoted into product and became a leader in the space and have done really well. I think product is a great place to go if you're more of a generalist and want to explore and can talk the talk when it comes to tech, but don't necessarily code and develop. So I think that's a great spot and a good entry point.
Yeah, by the way, we had a webcast on product management, and actually it was one of the 4 volunteers who we worked together to put these together. He's at Google, and he's good at technology, but he's a product manager. And he said, product manager, the key skill is how do you get the coders and the marketing people and so forth all to talk to each other and be coordinated. And he said that so the highest skill is not being the best programmer. It's how do you get people to work together and aim in the same direction? Because obviously sales, marketing, and product development, they better be aimed in the same direction or they won't do very well. Doug, any comments about career paths and how do you get into the profession? I mean, if you were, say, you're just graduating from Tufts, right, and you want to go into fintech, what would you do? I mean, how would you figure out how to get into the profession?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think first of all, it's good to have a Jewish mother who commutes from Princeton to New York every day and hands out your resume on New Jersey Transit. So that was very useful. But in all seriousness, I think really using your network. I mean, the Yale network is just incredible. So going out and using the network is the best way, I think, to find a job. In terms of areas, well, let me say another thing. Small companies do not have HR departments, right? And they're putting out fires all day. And if they see a really good resume come over the transom, they'll respond. Right? Unlike going to a big company, which is great, but it goes to HR and into some abyss. Mm-hmm. So really be proactive when you're going out to small fintech companies. Most of them are hiring, even in this environment. I mean, certainly some big ones are not, but most small fintech companies are hiring. I also think sales is huge. So every company, fintech company, good salespeople, young, aggressive salespeople are hard to find. And it's a great way also to learn the industry and to learn about the company.
Yeah. You know, Doug, you
Yeah.
made a really good point. I mean, it's amazing how helpful fellow alumni will be who don't even know you, right? I mean, and so, of course, the key is how do you figure out who among the alumni, you know, is in the area? And there's a simple thing you do. You just go to LinkedIn and you search on
Exactly.
Fintech and Yale and whatever, and boom, you're going to get 60 connections of people who somehow are connected to Yale and are in Fintech. So it's you know, it's not impossible. I mean, you still have to do some work, but it's not impossible. And it's amazing how many of them are going to help, right? And you'll get all sorts of different flavors when you do that as well. You know?
No doubt.
Yeah.
And I think it's just one more comment. It's the little things, right? So even the title of your emails, right, to people in fintech companies is very important. I mean, like you do, Peter and Bryce, we get hundreds of emails a day.
Yeah.
But if I see, you know, something that says, you know, Jumbo's basketball, that's the Tufts nickname, of course.
As
Right.
opposed to Bulldog, right?
That's a whole nother issue. Why my college has jumbos, but we won't go there. But in all seriousness, I think, you know, being catchy, getting someone's attention is really important.
The next question is, we ask, by the way, all these questions except the first one, right? There's the same question we ask for every profession for these panels, right? Because they turn out to be the right question. So the next question is, every profession has myths versus realities. Maybe if the two of you can sort of say, in fintech, what are the things that are myths and realities that relate to careers, right? I mean, obviously not things that are not related to careers. Any myths and you know, versus realities in fintech?
I think we touched on one, and maybe Doug can follow up here, but something about every fintech or where each fintech plays isn't necessarily a sexy part of the industry. Fintech isn't always sexy, but it can be. But there's plenty of opportunities in the not so noticed areas that are plenty lucrative and plenty interesting if you can find an end to those niches. So I would start there.
Mm-hmm. Doug, any comments, myths and versus realities?
Um,
Any myths that you figured out were myths, you know, along the way and said, oh shit, this was
Were created, myths I
created.
created.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, right. I mean, I think going back to blockchain and crypto, I would say 90% of the companies who approach us and say, yeah, we're blockchain, we use the blockchain or tokens. When you go through to the business model, there's absolutely no need for these companies to use the blockchain, right?
Yeah.
Or
And misuse of the technology.
no doubt. And, you know, you just got to be careful of these buzzwords, whether it's AI, quantum. I mean, we play a game actually when companies come in to present. And disruption is 1 point, blockchain is 2 points, AI is 3 points. And the more points the company gets, the less likely we're to invest.
Yeah. Just to second that, far too many companies are using blockchains like marketing, a way to say that they're interesting and more interesting than they really are. And to Doug's point, it's not always necessary. Sometimes they plug it in to try to use it just to claim that they're using blockchain, but it might not be the right fit. And so doing some interviewing and researching that, understanding that will help you avoid some of the companies that are maybe doing it just for the marketing effect.
Yeah, I know one myth, not because I'm an expert, just because from talking to people, is people tend to associate fintech with small to medium and startup companies, but the reality is fintech is being used by huge companies, right? So you could have a career in fintech. It doesn't necessarily mean you got to be at a small to medium-sized company. I mean, JP Morgan Chase and Walmart, I mean, they're heavy users of fintech. Now, you have to decide whether you want to be at a large company, which is a different thing. But it's not true that in order to be in fintech, you have to be in a high growth or small company. Is that fair?
That's a great point. Great point. Absolutely.
Yeah, and certainly those two paths, if you want to distinguish between large corporate entities that are building fintech and smaller companies, the roles look different too, right? The number of hats that you wear at a small company is going to be a lot more than at a large company, where you're probably going to be hyper focused on one area. But in a small company, you're just pulled in so many directions and asked to do so much because you are small and trying to be scrappy. So you'll end up doing more things.
Yeah.
You should understand yourself around that, like what you're willing to do. And frankly, you might get a better or something closer to a 9 to 5 or an 8 to 6 in the corporate side, and something in the earlier tech side, you might have demands at strange hours and long weeks.
Yeah. And, you know, startups are all the fad right now, and it's not really the right place for everyone. And I think a lot of people,
Absolutely.
a lot of young people are going to startups where they really shouldn't be. I think if they're wonderful opportunities, startups are wonderful, but you really have to feel like it's a good fit, because one, the level of risk could be high, but the other is, you know, they've got to get certain things right or pivot fast if they're going to survive, and so you got to pick the right ones, right?
No doubt.
The next question is one that I love, because it really applies to, it's a good question for all professions. And that is, what are the characteristics of people who tend to do well in fintech and end up happy, you know, versus obviously the people who are not. And by the way, we've done 50, 60 of these, it's amazing how the answer is actually quite different if you go to different professions in terms of what are the characteristics for those people who do well and are happy, right? So any thoughts about, you know, it's a little unfair just because fintech is so segmented, right? So it's a little bit of an unfair question, but, you know, it'll be helpful to the audience if you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I think maybe a throw.
Go ahead, Bryce. No,
I was going to say maybe a throwback to the last question would be, depending on where you're working, right? That early fintech company and wearing different hats, you're going to have to be able to multitask a lot more than you would in the corporate segment. So there's certainly a difference, right, about who would succeed in the corporate version of fintech and who succeeds in the startup or early tech side of fintech. So certainly you need to understand yourself. I think that's key here, but the skill that you need if you want to go into early tech around being kind of a jack of all trades, I think that's the reality, right? You have to develop a lot of skills and learn a lot of things quickly, right? Be able to pick things up quickly, be able to multitask, be able to talk to clients one day and then talk to internal tech teams the next day to solve problems internally. I think that's just what it looks like in most early tech companies.
Doug?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, much to the disappointment, again, I don't know why I'm talking about my parents, but much to the disappointment of my parents, I turned down a job with an analyst position at an investment bank out of college to go work at Instinet, which had 22 people. And I know I would have really not done well at a big organization. I just know my personality and what I like, and being involved in lots of different things, which is why venture capital is just a natural sort of progression for me. But I just keep going back. Look, the people who rise to the top, there are so many skilled people out there, so many. It's, do you really like what you're doing, and are you passionate about it? Because if you are, that will come through. So
Yeah,
some
well, the
people.
ideal combination is if you have a passion, but also you're a good fit skill wise, right?
No doubt.
And I remember one guy, a friend of mine who works at Morgan Stanley, but he's in the asset management side, stock trading and so forth. And he said the first question he asks young people who apply, he said, when you were in high school and college, did you have a brokerage account, even for small amounts of money in trade stocks? And he says, if the person says no, he says, that's it, you're not a fit. Because if you didn't fall in love with the stock market, if you didn't have a love for it, then you're not going to do well. And it was a very interesting comment, right? And by the way, I never had a stock brokerage account when I grew up. And, when he said that, I said, well, thank God I never applied for a job, investing in stocks, because I would have been a disaster by that, by that definition, So, any other comments about fit? Because this fit issue is so critical, right? For people making career decisions, right? You need to know about the industry, but you also need to know the fit. Can you think of any characteristics of people who just aren't making it, but it's obvious why, that it's something related to their skill set or their personality or whatever, that, that you say, well, if you're like this, you probably just shouldn't think about it, right?
Yeah, I think people who, think laterally just tend to do a lot better at, unless you're a programmer, right? Which you really need to, you can think laterally as well, but you really need to be focused. Thinking laterally at a smaller firm works a lot better if that's the way your mind works, as opposed to doing one thing at a big organization. I guess the other, just the other thing I'd mention is, look, about learning. You should be interested, but this isn't, you could think of it as you could be working, as we all know, at 6 or 7 places throughout your career. So, where are you going to learn and contribute?
Yeah. Doug talked about thinking laterally, and I agree with that. We can use that term. But if you're a founder, or if you find yourself in a position where you can influence the direction of a company at some point, you need to be pointed in how you think laterally. Like everything you're thinking across the board should be going towards the end goal of your company, and your company should have a focus. And founders that I've met that have tried to chase the headlines, right? They're like, hey, we can pivot and go to construction tech and probably capture a little bit of funding there, and then jump to another industry, and they think they can continually pivot and never focus on what they're doing well. Those founders don't succeed. So there is some focus that you need, but the thinking laterally, I agree. It's like thinking across the whole organization and how you move that organization forward in a concerted way.
Now we have 11 questions, so I'm going to move to Q&A shortly. But the last question we always ask, which is a little, shall we say, maybe a little less appropriate for fintech because it's a relatively new industry, is if you don't retire with the gold watch, what are the things that you can do, and where are the off ramps? This is actually a favorite question for things like the legal profession, right? Because a lot of people say, well, if you get tired of being a lawyer, where can you go? And there's some great answers about that. So fintech's relatively new, so there are fewer people with, gold watches who've worked there for 25 years. But, what is it for the things you learn and that you do in fintech? What does it qualify you to do in terms of other professions, or have you seen that you've seen, right, among people in the industry where they've gone off to do something else?
Yeah, I think being involved as being a good investor in this sector, I think in any other sector as well, but certainly in this sector, having operating experience and knowing how companies operate, what are the dynamics, is really important. So a good number of people go from operating into investing, and also I've in a banking, fintech banking, to being an entrepreneur or going in some advisor role or operating role.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So, well, go ahead, Bryce.
I was just going to say, certainly successful entrepreneurs either become serial entrepreneurs or they do what Doug was mentioning. Some of them become advisors to others or investors in the space. I think that's a common
That's right.
next step.
Or they buy the Brooklyn Nets or something like that, right?
Something like that is also a possibility. Right?
Now,
Exactly.
I'm going to turn to the questions, and I'll walk through the ones. There was one that actually, Bryce, you saw and you answered, but I'll turn it around. The first question that someone typed in is, if someone wants to embark on a career in fintech, how important is learning / understanding code in school? You answered that, but why don't I turn it around and say, what are the kinds of things that you could major in or study that would be helpful for a fintech career?
Yeah. There's certainly courses out there, but I don't know of dedicated programs to products, but I think that's interesting. You can get a background in general business, and you can apply that to product or as an entrepreneur, certainly. I think that there's opportunity to learn marketing and leverage that at fintechs as well. You could be a software developer if you want to. I think that's another path. So those are a few. Doug, anything you'd add?
Yeah, I think, almost any major, I think the things that's becoming increasingly important in fintech is behavioral science and behavioral economics, and how do you guide people's behavior. That is, I think, an important thing, or a good way to get into a fintech company. Certainly, if you want to be a programmer, learning to code and being a computer science major makes a lot of sense. I even think, psychology, I think, is a great major. Life is about getting along with people, and within organizations, that's really important, and understanding and impacting culture.
Yeah. And if we want to separate data science from general engineering or software development, I think data science is a big one as well.
By the way, Doug, I went to a conference which had a lot of technology people over the weekend, and one of the things they set up was a place where you could go and have your EQ tested, and that was quite controversial because it was very interesting, because a lot of people then said, well, what was your EQ? And it turned out that EQ was actually, they all concluded that EQ was just as important as IQ, right? And that's your point about how do you work with people, right?
Absolutely.
The next question is more a crystal ball question, which is, what has a more dominant contribution to financial services, or will rather, over the next 20 years? AI, blockchain, or a combination of the two? Don't feel any pressure, because based on that answer, they're going to decide where they go work, right?
Yeah, understood. I think the answer is both. I think AI is I think AI right now has a bigger impact on fintech and on the industry. And making better decisions is absolutely critical for, let's say, an asset manager figuring out. I ran a company, as Peter said, which got all kinds of online data and wacky data sets from the exhaustive software packages. And we had applied mathematicians slice and dice and crunch the data until it correlated for 2 years very accurately to things like Google revenues or CarMax same-store comps. So having technology that really aids the decision-making process is just exceptionally powerful. Blockchain, look, I don't want to come off. Some of our best investments have been in blockchain. I think we're still figuring out the use cases. I think tokenization of assets, let's say a venture portfolio or a real estate portfolio, is something where something like the blockchain makes sense. NFTs, I think a great use case, which isn't necessarily fintech, are loyalty programs. So loading up an NFT with, let's just say, you could say a fintech company like a Robinhood could have a loyalty program that is tokenized and that people can, in essence, trade in the secondary market. We're still figuring out blockchain.
There's a question here from Bradley Marknet, says, how's the fintech community view biometrics? I don't know enough to understand the question, but maybe our panelists will, if they know more about biometrics.
I mean, I'm probably in the same boat. Haven't spent a ton of time on biometrics to be able to speak to it.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think where biometrics, I think, can be very helpful is we spend a lot of time in AML, KYC, anti-money laundering, know your customer, and in things like crypto, it's becoming increasingly important to do so, and something with biometrics can help. There's no doubt it can play a role.
Yeah. Well, certainly a lot of the companies like the Visas and MasterCards and the banks are all using all sorts of technologies and biometric to try to create more secure transactions, et cetera. I mean, that it's a big part of it. Anonymous attendee asked the following question: is an MB not as critical anymore as fintech? I guess as it relates to being in fintech. And should you just go straight into industry, or is it useful to get an MBA? Hopefully this is not somebody who's already an MBA student.
I hope you're not already in the program and deciding. Yeah. I'll encourage you to finish an MBA if you've started, and frankly, I got an MBA and couldn't be happier about that decision, and know plenty that got MBAs and have gone into fintech or not into fintech, and they're happy with that decision. Now, is it crucial? I don't know that you need an MBA to get into fintech. I think we've talked about a number of different entry points into fintech, and an MBA is not the silver bullet to get there, nor is it the prerequisite that everyone's asking for. But could it be a great tool to get into fintech? Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's one of the. I mean, it's one of the industries where it really isn't necessary to enter and successfully enter the workforce. So I don't think you need an MBA.
Frank Sorrenti has a question, which is, when looking at fintech subsectors, where do you find the best runways for growth? And then he lists a couple of areas: payments, wealth, asset management, regulatory, real estate, et cetera. Do you find one more saturated than the other? Or because the upside down, which is less growth or whatever. So any comments about the ones that he's listed? And of course, one of those obviously is the one you're in, Bryce, right?
Yeah, so I think there's plenty of runway for growth in the real estate space. So I think I said that earlier. I'll restate it here. And now asset management, I suspect you're talking about individuals' assets and managing those assets, not real estate asset management. But I think those are both reasonably sound markets that are still growing as well.
Yeah, I think one thing that we'll continue to see are new asset management products or new products to invest in, and where technology has really helped. And again, as I said, where blockchain can really help is the democratization of assets. So you can buy $50,000 of a commercial real estate portfolio, or $10,000 of a venture portfolio. So there's lots of really interesting business models to democratize assets and asset classes, and also create new ones.
There's one area I happen to know, which is payments, and that is a huge area for fintech and blockchain and so forth, because all of us know, even just general members of the population, that there's this huge movement away from cash and even credit cards, and the development of the direct deposit, Zells and everything in the world. So there's a huge amount of innovation that's going on the payment side. And in order to do that, obviously, you have to have things like blockchain and so forth in order to make sure that these transactions, payments are secure. So that's going to be a very high growth area, but also very complex, right? Because it all depends upon what parts of payments and so forth you're talking about. And both large and small and medium-sized companies are in this. I mean, the big banks are investing as much in payments as anybody else, right? Because that's their turf.
Yeah, to your point, it's a really crowded space. It's not something where we're seeing opportunities, a lot of opportunities for small companies, but to your point, medium size and large companies have developed massive businesses and innovative businesses, like Stripe, let's say. And going to work for one of those companies would be a really interesting opportunity.
Yeah. Okay, here's an interesting question, and you guys may or may not, feel like you can answer it. But Derek Sherry says, "What does a day working in fintech look like?"
It's a great question.
It's a great question, difficult question, but a great question.
You wake up at 11, you turn on the World Cup, and well, Bryce, why don't you take a shot at it, and then I'll come back to a real answer.
That's an interesting one. So I think it's different where you play, right, and where you end up, what your career path is, what kind of company, if it's corporate or small company, your day is going to look different. If you're wearing those different hats that we talked about, then your day really looks different every day, right? You might be in a product role, talking to clients, trying to figure out what features that they're looking for, and doing interviews, and then putting that information that you've gathered into coherent thoughts that you can then push over to your engineering team to educate them on what they should be building. Or you could be leading the company and making strategic decisions about where you're going to play next, if you feel like you've reached maturity in a certain portion of your market, and you're making decisions about where you should take the company next. And that can be really tough, and you're maybe calling some board members to get some advice, some advisors. If you're raising capital, you're on the road all the time, and maybe nearly 100% of your time is dedicated to fundraising, and you're hoping your company is holding on without your input every, hour. So I think depending on what your role is, it looks different. Depending on the size of the company, it looks different. So there's all sorts of different day-to-days found in fintech. I don't know. Doug, you want to add to that?
I think that's right. I mean, I am involved, heavily in fintech, but again, as an investor, but it is really doing a lot of reading, talking to people about trends in the industry, getting pitches from companies, speaking to our portfolio CEOs, helping them with introductions and, like, say, things like pricing and packaging. So it's varied.
Yeah. Well, Doug, of the 16 questions, 2 refer to the phrase jumbo, but they relate just to you. So I won't repeat them, but I'm going to end with one good question from Natalia Doris, who says, and this is very relevant actually, given what the 2 of you do, which is, how would you go about evaluating a startup when considering pursuing a job at the company? Any red flags you would look out for? And it's actually a good question for the 2 of you, because you're constantly evaluating whether a startup is any good or not. Now, Natalia is sort of saying, if you're thinking of applying for a job, what are the kinds of red flags, and how would you evaluate?
Yeah,
I think,
just restate oh, go ahead, Doug. Go ahead.
I mean, I think it's really doing a ton of work on not only the company, but the sector the company's in. What other companies are successful? Does this company speak to people in the industry? And really figure out, does this company have a real shot at doing something? Because 80 to 90% of of venture companies just are not successful. And choosing the company and where it sits in the ecosystem is really important. And I'm very surprised when I interview people and try to tease out what they think in those areas, and so many people have not thought it through. I think the other thing is definitely the people, and I think you can get a pretty good idea meeting them. I also, it's my bias, maybe it's my age, I tend to be wary of people who change jobs every 1.5 or 2 years. And if there's a lot of people in the company that have done that, that is a yellow flag for me.
Yeah.
Bryce, you're a heavy investor and you're looking at startups all the time. How do you evaluate, and what are red flags that you look for?
Yeah, I'll build on that yellow flag that Doug was just mentioning. Not just folks that move frequently being employed there, I think that is a concern, but if you can uncover any recent departures where co-founders have left, that's certainly a red flag, and you should be concerned about what shakeups happening at the company if there's a major departure like that. Another red flag might be interviewing or maybe just researching who's running the company and what kind of experience they have in the sector that they're chasing. If they don't have a lot of experience, you may want to understand who in the team is giving them the right advice to chase the sector that they're going after. If they don't have a way to plug in and learn the industry, it's going to be tough for them to succeed. And then you can do your own SWOT analysis if you want to on the company. Look at the strengths, look at the weaknesses, look for the opportunities for that company, and what are the competitors, what are the threats, and that might help shape your ideas on the company that you're looking at.
I was in the venture business for a number of years with a leading venture firm, and I think one thing you ought to ask is, you got to look at the CEO and the couple of most senior people and say, how good are they at running a startup? Because I will tell you, it is not necessarily true that all people coming from a large company fail doing as startups, but it's a tough transition. Because if you work for a
Huge.
large company, you're so used to having things done for you and all sorts of stuff, and you have a brand you can lean on, and you can't do that with a startup, right? So it's not to say that someone who is very successful at GE or whatever, right, couldn't do a startup, but it's a question you've got to ask to say, can that team, can that CEO, and can that team make the transition to having to wash your own bottles and everything else, right? Right, Doug?
It's a great point. Yeah, I concur. I think all things being equal, we do not like that profile for a first-time entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with that, I like starting on time and ending on time, but I'm going to ask the two panelists if they have one word or one phrase they want to tell the audience as a takeaway. What would that be? It's sort of like, that famous film where the guy turns to The Graduate and says plastics, right? So do you have a phrase you want the audience to walk away remembering?
Bryce, I'm letting you go first while I think about this. So
Yeah,
I'm being kind, I'm being a gentleman and letting you go first, by the way.
Is that what it is, Doug? Is that what it is?
Doug,
That's good.
other people would call that stalling.
Yes.
I'll call it what it is, Doug. It's
One
stalling.
person stall. Yeah.
So I'll put something out there. I think that at an early fintech company, something that you may hear resonate, which is fail fast. I think as a young person, you have an opportunity to enter the market and fail fast or fail forward, whatever version of that you want to take. There's opportunities to explore when you're starting your career and entering and learning a lot up front is worth doing. And if it's not what you want to do, you can, try another startup, try another company in the space, and you have opportunities. So I'll say fail fast. Pivot quickly, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I would just say stay away from bright, shiny objects. Really do your work, and don't think because fintech's sexy, don't think you should go into fintech, just like you shouldn't necessarily go into investment banking if you really take a look at yourself and go, this is not something I want to do, or I'm not a big company or small company person.
Yeah, terrific.
And use your network. Use that network.
Yeah, and if the Yale one doesn't work, try the Tufts one, right?
We're filled with dentists, and veterinarians. So if you all want to be in those two fields, by all means.
Well, I want to thank both of you, Bryce and Doug, for really doing a great job of answering these questions. And I think the audience, you had some really good questions, but also I hope you come away with a better sense for whether fintech is a good place for you to be or not. But I want to thank thank our two panelists, and this is being recorded, and you can go to yalecareerpanels.com, and Doug, if you want to binge watch the recording over and over again, that'll be your opportunity. So thank you, both of you, and I really appreciate the time, and thank you to the audience for the really good questions you've asked.
Thank you, Peter, for the invitation, and thanks for the questions. I think